His vision was simple: build an affordable and reliable car that anybody could buy. And he built tons of them. I'm not talking about Henry Ford, I'm talking about Allenson Brush. Never heard of him? Well, meet his creation. Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter on the automotive evolution. And of course, we're here once again at the Martin Auto Museum in Phoenix. And this 1910 Brush is a perfect example of this collection, how it really spans the full automotive spectrum. I don't know about you, but I had never heard of a Brush until this thing showed up here in the museum. But before we talk about this particular car, don't forget to like and subscribe down below. And in the comments, let me know, of course, what I got right, what I got wrong, if you know anything about these brushes. And this week, I have a fun question for you. I want to know, what is the oldest car that you've either ever driven or at the very least gotten a ride in? I can't wait to hear the answers. Some of you I know have been in some pretty old stuff. All right, now let's talk about this 1910 Brush Runabout. It was really one of the most unique and affordable cars of the early automotive era. It was built by a company called the Brush Motor Car Company. It was in Detroit, Michigan. It was designed to be simple, rugged, and inexpensive. Qualities, well, it really made it stand out at a time when an awful lot of cars were costly and complicated. Now, before we dive too much into the history of the Brush automobile, let's talk about what was happening in the automotive world back in 1910. Now, back then, the U.S. auto industry was still in what we'll call the Wild West phase. There really was not a dominant big three like we have today. There were hundreds and hundreds of small companies trying their hand at building cars. I've heard some estimates that say there were between 250 and 300 active automobile manufacturers in the U.S. in 1910. Some, like Ford, Buick, Cadillac, even Studebaker, would go on to survive and become major players in the automotive industry. But an awful lot of these companies that were building cars back then were tiny regional operations. They were producing only a handful of vehicles. Companies like Lozier, Kissel, Carter Car, or Abbott just didn't survive. Some had great ideas but no money. Others had money but lousy ideas. All right, let's get back to this Brush Runabout. Now, the Brush Motor Car Company was founded in 1907 by Allenson Partridge Brush. He was an engineer who had already helped Cadillac design their first single-cylinder engine. Brush, though, believed that America needed a lighter, smaller car, one that could handle dirt roads and cost far less than the big automobiles of the day. And his answer? Well, this car right here, the Brush Runabout. It's a little quirky, but it's pretty clever. Instead of heavy steel frame, it used hickory wood for both the axles and the frame, which Brush claimed was more flexible and durable. It also had a single-cylinder, 10-horsepower engine, had coil springs for a smoother ride, and even a strange friction-drive transmission that made it easier to operate than a lot of cars of the time. And the price, well, that was special, $485 in 1910, a bargain compared to larger cars. Brush marketed heavily to women and doctors, groups that wanted something light, reliable, and easy to handle. And this little car right here quickly gained a reputation for toughness. And then, in 1910, something happened that they gave this car right here national headlines, the kind of publicity that would put any company on the map. All right, I want you to imagine this. Two young brothers driving a car from New York to Oklahoma. And while that sounds pretty impressive, wait until you hear their ages. These two were just 9 and 6 years old. Their names were Lewis and Temple Abernathy, and that's the trip they supposedly made. Now, they were the sons of a guy who was quite a character. He was a U.S. Marshal. His nickname was Catch 'em Alive Jack Abernathy of Oklahoma. He believed in raising his boys to be fearless. Now, the brothers first made headlines for riding a horse from Oklahoma all the way to New York to meet President Roosevelt, supposedly by themselves. But they got even more headlines for their return trip. This time, they set out in a Brush Runabout, an automobile. They left from New York, and the boys steered their little Brush westward. They went across rivers, they went across muds and roads that were barely there. Of course, they had no GPS, few maps, and almost supposedly no help from adults, but they pushed on mile after mile. Newspapers tracked their progress, and the public marveled that two children could handle such a journey. And by the time they reached Oklahoma, the Abernathy boys had proven not only their own grit, but also the durability and the reliability of the Brush Runabout. The adventure gave the Brush Motor Car Company, well, truly priceless publicity. I mean, if two kids could drive from one coast all the way to Oklahoma. Surely any adult could do it as well. Let's walk around and take a closer look at our 1910 Brush, almost identical to the one that the Abernathy boys would have been driving during their cross-country jaunt. And the first thing that gets your attention when you look at the front of this car is all of the wood. And it's not just the frame. Look at the axle down below. That is white hickory. Both front and rear axles are made of that. And you'll notice at one end, it tapers down to this metal fitting right here. That connects to this knuckle that then goes to the wheel. It's got ball bearings. And then look at this. It's got an actual shock absorber, a spring right here. Now, you have to remember the Ford back then was using transverse leaf springs from one side to the other. They were very sturdy, really good for the roads that were so bad back then, but it's very likely that this shock absorber would allow the Brush to have a slightly smoother ride. So it's kind of an interesting concept. Taking a look at the wheels and the tires, they were 32 inches, which was considered the smallest reasonable size tire for an automobile back in those days. Of course, there were wooden spokes that had a steel rim, and the tires themselves, well, the tires, of course, were solid core, not pneumatic. They thought they were easier, simpler to build, and most importantly, not likely to get punctures. Once again, even the back of this car, all this is made of wood. If you look back here, you can see the chain drive that's actually driving the vehicle. And these right here are drum brakes. They're 8.5-inch drum brakes. And it's pretty interesting. There's a steel band inside, and it actually uses brake shoes, which had canvas facings on them, so you could replace them and make sure you were able to stop. Now, one other interesting thing was the way you would actually power this car. They talked about the fact that you could use gasoline, you could use kerosene, you could use alcohol, but they also promoted the fact that you could use something called Peruna. Now, I've never heard of this stuff, but apparently back in the early 1900s, it was a very popular cure-all. People said, oh, you should drink this stuff. It was 20% alcohol. Brush actually did tests and showed that their cars could run on this Peruna concept. And the great thing was their advertising made the point that Peruna was everywhere, so you were never going to run out of fuel as long as there was a pharmacy nearby. Now, the 1910 Brush Runabout was unusual not just because of its wooden frame and its light weight. It also had a very distinctive engine. At its heart was a single-cylinder, 4-stroke motor that produced about 10 horsepower. This little engine was air-cooled, and it had a very simple design, meaning that it was both rugged and it was easy to maintain, especially important back in those days. At just about 100 cubic inches, just under that. And because the car really doesn't weigh very much, less than 1,000 pounds, this 10 horsepower was enough to push the Runabout to about 35 miles an hour. Now, the transmission, it was also pretty unconventional. Instead of the usual planetary gear setup that a lot of cars were using back then, the Brush used something called a friction drive system. Think of it like a spinning disc with another wheel pressed against it. You could change the speed and direction just by moving that wheel across the disc. Now, it wasn't very powerful, but it was simple, it was lightweight, and once again, inexpensive to build. Unfortunately, at the same time, the Model T, which had been introduced in 1908, had a 4-cylinder, 20 horsepower engine. So you had double the horsepower that was available compared to this Brush. And you put that together with the fact that Ford had a Model T steel frame. It could carry more passengers. It could also handle tougher terrain. So the small engine and the friction drive in this Brush was really creative. It just really wasn't as competitive once the Model T came on really strong. And that's part of what ultimately led to the demise, probably, of the Brush Motor Company. Now, to be perfectly honest, I can't speak very much about the driving and how you drive this particular car, the Brush from 1910, here in the museum, because I don't know how. I mean, we're kind of landlocked here at the museum and can't exactly drive it around. And to be honest with you, I don't know anybody who's ever driven one of these. Most people haven't even heard of them. So if you know how to drive one of these, I'd love to hear about it. I mean, when it comes to the Model T, there's no shortage of information, right? How to start it, how to drive it, how to keep it on the road. But for a Brush, well, we're kind of on our own for this one, I think, for the most part. One thing I do want to point out right off the bat is that this car has a left-hand drive steering wheel. Now, back then, a lot of car companies were putting the steering wheel on the right-hand side. For example, here in the museum, we've got a 1909 Rio, steering wheel on the right-hand side. 1905 Cadillac, steering wheel on the right-hand side. But Ford's, the Model Ts back then, had the steering wheel on the left-hand side, and that was becoming the norm. So this Brush Runabout also had it on the left-hand side, and ultimately in the United States, Not only would it become the norm, it would become the mandate. Now, to start this car, of course, you had the crank up front that would crank over the engine. Then you, on the steering wheel, you had these two little things right here, these two handles. One was for the spark, the other was for the throttle. And on the side, you had this lever. I'm assuming that moving forward would put it into drive, moving it backwards would put it in reverse. Remember that friction drive? The cool thing, it enabled the car to go forward or backward with that friction drive. It only had one pedal, a single pedal, and this was for the brakes. So there was no throttle on the floor, nothing to engage gears, a single pedal to engage the brake. This, I believe, would actually turn it on, this little button right here, or switch that's actually missing right here. But once again, it's exposed to all the elements. I do know that there were tops that you could get for these. I'm not sure if it was just an option you bought or something you made. But to be honest with you, the seat's actually fairly reasonable. If you got that spring suspension, it might not have been too bad of a car to drive, but it was still pretty basic. Just imagine driving this around back in 1910 with that spring suspension and that one-cylinder motor. The Brush motor car was not just sold here in the United States, it was around the world. The company advertised that they had agents in Europe, Mexico, and New Zealand. But the Brush could not outrun one competitor. Henry Ford's Model T. Introduced in 1908, the Model T was a little more expensive at first, but it had more power, more space, and as Ford's assembly line soon drove the prices down lower, well, the Brush simply couldn't compete. In 1912, Brush joined the United States Motor Company. It was a merger of smaller automakers together. Unfortunately, that merger ultimately failed, and by 1913, the Brush Motor Car Company was gone. Now, Brush himself, Alanson Brush, would go on to a distinguished consulting career. He was an engineer working for General Motors, American LaFrance, and a number of other companies. One thing we don't really know is how many Brush motor cars were made. We just have estimates, and those estimates have put it at more than 10,000, which means that for one brief, shining moment in the automotive evolution, the Brush Motor Car Company really had its time in the sun. And now, unfortunately, this Brush is just an interesting piece of automotive history.